Okay, here we go. I believe we're going. I'm going to hit presentation. Um, Looks like I need to hit it again. And this is what we would have covered in class fourth period today. And hopefully I can get it sent out to you. All right, so the age of imperialism is really kind of the next topic. We got World War I coming up. It's going to be the last topic before we test. We'll test next week. Looks like Wednesday in the Black Day classes. And so at the end of the 19th century is when kind of the age of late 1800s, early 1900s is the age of, is kind of the new imperialism. You'd have the colonialism that led to, the British colonies, mercantilism and all that sort of thing. But now you got this new imperialism around the turn of the century, going on worldwide in Britain and France, Belgium, Germany, expanding their empires as much as they can. And then the question is the United States going to get in on this? And so there were some arguments for it and some arguments against it. We were ambivalent about it, so doesn't really match our history of being somebody who broke off from the British Empire. But on the other hand, as a rising industrial power. All right, so here's our reasons. Those who argued that we should become imperialists said, here's 5 reasons. Number 1, market. It's economics. Our farmers need places to sell their goods. Our industry needs places to sell their goods. You got the steel industry, the oil industry. You got all these farmers out here. So colonies set up guaranteed markets, just the way mercantilism worked in the American colonies, would function for the British way back prior to 1776. All right, second off, you've got these journalists. They're called the Yellow Journalists. Hertz and Pulitzer are the 2 leaders. They've got the New York World and the New York Journal. And they're competing with each other to sell the most newspapers. And the way they do it, they report on current events, but they sensationalize things. Certain things in common with today's press. But they really pushed it. They felt like it was in their interest for us to do that sort of thing. They would sell more papers if that's good headlines that the United States has expanded its empire. Okay. Manifest Destiny, you're just expanding Manifest Destiny past the 48 mainland states here. So expanded it to the rest of the world. So Josiah Strong was a guy who was very much in favor of that. We're going to compete with the rest of the world. Well, no, that's not a competition thing. It's, hey, we're the best. We're the Anglo-Saxon. There's a racism part of this. We're Anglo-Saxon. We're supposed to spread our way of life, our democracy, our Protestant Christianity. So Manifest Destiny is part of that. Similarly, social Darwinism. Teddy Roosevelt is a big believer in this, was a big believer in this. Survival of the fittest. So 2 countries fight. Whoever wins gets to take over the other ones. Henry Cabot Lodge also, and the thinking that conflict like that makes you strong and, survival of the fittest. All right, and Roosevelt was also a believer in the importance of Navy power, that if you're going to be a world power, you got to have a strong Navy. There's a guy named Alfred Lord Mahan who wrote a book about this. All right, so those are your 5 reasons why someone would want the United States to have an empire. Okay, as we were thinking about this, there was a number of places that we might get, number of countries we might get, so in a war with, so the drums of war are kind of rumbling with a lot of different countries. So we almost got in a war with dividing up Samoa. Samoa got the Samoan Islands got divided up east and west. And why do we care? Because they're on the way to Asia, like Hawaii is. And so ever since the Civil War, we'd been kind of looking at expanding our trade into China, and so we needed kind of naval bases, needed places we owned on the way to Asia there. So Samoa is one of those places. and Germany had a claim to it too, so we split it up. Those of you who sports fans know that on a pretty regular basis you see Samoan football players on TV, and our connection with Samoa goes back to this period. All right, there were lynchings of Italians in New Orleans. Remember, at the time, the Italians were seen as non-white, so it's kind of consistent with the pattern of lynchings. There was tension with Chile over the deaths of some sailors. We were fussing with Canada over seal hunting around the Arctic, and with Britain over claims of gold in Latin America. All right, so none of those particular situations are that, none of them are the straw that breaks the camel's back. None of them are the tipping point on imperialism, but it kind of sets the stage for something that could tip us in the direction of imperialism. All right. A lot of Americans wanted to annex Hawaii, make it part of the United States, take it over. There had been American sugar planters over there since the 1800s. The native Hawaiians had gotten disease same way Native Americans had, and so Native Hawaiians were actually a minority in Hawaii. A lot of Asian immigrants working in the sugar plantations, and then American sugar planters. And there was a deal negotiated in the 1890s whereby American sugar planters would get a special deal when trading, and foreign sugar planters wouldn't get this special deal from people who wanted to buy sugar. And so it's almost like a tariff, just about like a tariff. If you're American, you're not subject to the tariff, and if you're from another country, you're subject to the tariff. So it's a tariff kind of thing. So if Hawaii becomes part of the United States, Hawaiian sugar plantations get these favored prices for their sugar. So it's in the economic interest of Hawaiian sugar planters for it to become part of the United States. All right, the Queen of Hawaii was against it. Her name was Liliuokalani. I kind of like, it's got a nice little Hawaiian rhythm to the name. She's also famous for the song Aloha that you always hear on, shows with Hawaii, Hawaii 5-0 or any movies with Hawaii, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, if you know that song. Aloha. She wrote that song. All right, so she's kind of a Hawaiian nationalist, and she wants to remain an independent country as opposed to a territory of the United States. Okay, and then everything kind of comes to a head when we start having diplomatic tensions with Spain. So Spain, their empire had been, their empire here in the Western Hemisphere started with the Aztecs, and everybody in Latin America speaks Spanish, but that Spanish Empire had been on the decline for a long time. Remember, most of the countries had gotten their independence in the 1820s. That's why the Monroe Doctrine was passed, so that nobody else would come over here. But Spain was hanging on to Cuba. Rebels in Cuba wanted their independence, and we had, a natural sympathy for these rebels. So even as we're looking at imperialism for the United States, we're also kind of sympathetic to anti-imperialist forces or independence forces, especially in countries close to us. So they want their independence. And so Spain's trying to crack down. General Weyler was sent to Cuba from Spain, and felt like he could, and this is General Weyler right here, he could control the rebels by putting them in these what he called re-concentration camps. And so you have nice synthesis really to both World War II and concentration camps that we think about. Also to Vietnam, because the issue was Cubans would work, these Cuban rebels would work with the Spanish during the daytime. Then it would get night and they'd attack them, just like the Viet Cong. in the Vietnam War. But Spain reasoned that they couldn't do that if you put them all in camps. So they're all getting put in camps. But then you got everybody's concentrated together. You got the swamps and the mosquitoes and the heat, and so people are dying and they're starving. And so there's a picture of kids in these camps, and thousands of Cubans are dying in these camps. So they're not death camps in the sense that you have gas showers like in World War II, but you do have very high rates of death among the people who are put in these camps. All right, so it becomes very controversial, and then the yellow journalists start writing about it, Pulitzer and Hearst. So Hearst is the guy kind of gets credit for starting this war, although in journalism today and in writing today, we have the Pulitzer Prize named after Pulitzer. But you have a boat sent to Cuba just to kind of observe things, the Maine. And the Maine blows up, and there's like 300 guys on board, something like 200 of them died. And further research has shown that the Maine blew up because there was a coal explosion. So, it was an internal problem. Nobody else did it. But America, following the lead of these yellow journalists, blamed Spain for it. And Hearst, in particular, was famous for sending a photographer named Remington over to Cuba, really to take pictures of all the terrible stuff that the Spanish were doing over there. And Remington wires him back on the telegraph and says, things have really kind of calmed down over here. It doesn't look like things are all that bad. And Hearst's famous for saying, look, just take some pictures, I'll provide a war. So Hearst wants a war because he can sell more newspapers if he has a war. So when that Maine blows up, Hearst has the Journal right there. And the Journal, he's a yellow journalist, the Journal says it was the work of an enemy. It was not an accident. And then Roosevelt's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he's just big time wanting to go to war. He thinks it's a great idea. Thinks that, football was just being invented, but he felt, the thinking was in Europe and the United States that the guys were turning into sissies and you need a war to make a man out of you. So war would be a good thing. Okay, I'm going to let you look at that. All right. Okay. So I don't know. You want to go down there and see what you can match up? Pause that for a second. Like give yourself a Jolly Rancher or go get a snack if you get a couple of them right. However you want to do that. Okay. But, good to kind of think about, see what you know. All right. Then go right here. All right. So then you got the Spanish-American War. Okay. McKinley doesn't know. Once the Maine blows up, McKinley doesn't know if he wants to go to war. There was a letter, it didn't quite make the PowerPoints in the reading, called the DeLome letter, where the Spanish ambassador to Cuba calls McKinley this wimpy little vacillating guy, can't make up mind what he wants to do and does whatever the people tell him, but he can't think for himself. So the president has already been insulted by Spain, and then Roosevelt and his best friend, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, that's him right there, pressures McKinley and tells him, you got to do this. You're a wimp if you don't, and he's a Republican. They're Republicans. So he kind of gets pushed into war. All right. The war declaration have an amendment to it called the Teller Amendment, and it said, hey, we're the good guys here. We're not going to make Cuba part of the United States. We're not going to annex it. We don't have imperial designs on Cuba. Once the war's over, Cuba's going to get its independence. All right, because we're declaring war on Spain, we fought Spain not only in Cuba, but also in the Philippines, which Cuba was holding on to. I had a student the last 2 years, and her name was a Hispanic last name. And for the first year, for the first semester I taught her, I assumed that, her family was from Mexico or, someplace in Latin America. originally, but she was Filipino. But she had this Hispanic sounding last name. Well, the reason for that is the Spanish made the Philippines part of the empire the same way they made Latin America part of the empire. All right, so we fought in the Philippines. The United States fought in the Philippines. The hero of that fighting was Commodore Dewey. The Spanish didn't have a lot of money. They had, they still had wooden ships, and so the American Navy didn't have much of a problem destroying those ships. He destroyed 10 ships in Manila Bay in the Philippines. So the fighting went quite well for us, both in the Philippines and in Cuba. Also in the Philippines, there were Filipino rebels wanting independence for the Philippines, just as there were rebels wanting independence for Cuba. And so the leader of the Filipino rebels was Emilio Aguinaldo, kind of like that name. And he helped defeat the Spanish in the Philippines. So the Spanish get overthrown in the Philippines. During the war, the United States annexed Hawaii as a provisioning station, a gas station, where the boats can fuel up on the way to the Philippines. And Pearl Harbor was one of these places, that the boats would stop. And so that's when Hawaii gets annexed. Okay, let's see. The fighting over there, the guy who was the commander, was not in real good shape. He had to ride around on a door. So says American Pageant. So really but in spite of maybe his lack of the fitness necessary to fight in a war, things go well for the American Army. The most famous guys fighting over there are Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. I think there's like 300 of them. Narrative history said there's like 300 of them. And they're Roosevelt and all his buddies. So let's do a little background on Roosevelt just for a second. So Roosevelt grew up a rich boy in New York. His family was a group of elites called the Knickerbockers. That's where the New York Knicks get their name. But he's got this terrible tragedy, all-time worst personal tragedy I've read about in a famous American's life. His wife and his mom die on the same day. His mom had been sick for a while, and then his wife dies in childbirth on the same day. And he had grown up kind of a sickly kid, didn't get to go outside all that much, but trains himself to kind of be a tough guy. And then when his over time. And when he has this personal tragedy, he does what Roosevelt always did. He's an interesting guy, one of the fascinating figures of American history. What he always does when times get tough, he turns to physical activity. So, like, when I get stressed out, I like to eat, a blizzard, an Oreo blizzard from Dairy Queen. But Roosevelt was a little better, had a little more healthy coping mechanisms than I do, and so he would do some sort of big-time physical activity to deal with it. Good workout, get it off your mind. So it's a good workout for this terrible tragedy. He was headed out to the coast and became a cowboy. And he hunted down horse thieves, and he, just became this real tough guy. The Dakota's really, really cold. And so he makes friends out there. So then he comes back. So when he joins the Army, like he had been the Secretary of Navy, and he says, well, I've been in favor of this war. So as soon as the war starts, he signs up, put your money where your mouth is kind of thing. And so the Rough Riders are made up of his buddies from Harvard, Ivy League athletes, and like cowboys from out west, and a lot of Indians too. There were members of all the civilized tribes that got sent on the Trail of Tears, if you remember that. Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw. Not Seminole, but those 4 other ones. All right, he had a horse. The Army didn't perform very well. They sent wool uniforms to guys in Cuba. The meat they was sent over in cans, and it killed a lot of guys. A lot more guys died of food poisoning and disease than died in battles. Like 300 died in battle, and 3,000 people died all total. So, and the Rough Riders only had one horse. I guess that's why their ride was rough. Roosevelt had a horse, and so he leads this charge up Kettle Hill. But there was another hill over called San Juan Hill, so San Juan Hill sounded better, more Spanish, and so they called it the charge up San Juan Hill. And big victory. All right. John Hay, who is going to go on to become Secretary of State, calls the Spanish-American War a splendid little war. The Spanish fleet was destroyed. Hawaii and Puerto Rico were taken over during the war. There's our numbers. 400 battle deaths, 5,000 to disease. And so, the fighting itself lasts something like 3 or 4 months. Very, comparable to maybe even closest to maybe 100 days. Maybe it's like close to Desert Storm, the original Desert Storm in length. All right, so we're getting stuff. It's gone from the war. It's gone well for us. We win. The big question coming out of the war is, though, what do we do about the Philippines? So we freed the Philippines from the Spanish, but all these other imperialist countries are looking at it, and they want their own independence. And so McKinley doesn't know what to do. So he pretty famously prays over it. And he decides that it's kind of our Christian duty to take over the Philippines and make them into good Americans. And so we paid the Spanish $20 million and we annexed the Philippines. All right, well, that was real controversial. There are people in the United States that didn't want us to be an imperialist country. And it was a kind of neat group of people. I think Mark Twain was in on it. Gompers, the labor union leader, as well as Carnegie, the industrialist. So you got quite a diverse group of people saying, that's not who we are. We don't go taking over other countries. So annexing the Philippines was a pretty controversial thing. There's the little thing. God spoke to them, colonized Philippines, educate them, uplift them, and Christianize them. All right, so there you go. All right, and here we go. All right, let's see how many we got. Oh, look at that. Wow. Okay. All right, so we'll get all the way into Roosevelt with this thing. All right, let's go down here and see what you know. Preview it just a little bit. Okay. Okay, the results of the war. So it's a Treaty of Paris. It's another Treaty of Paris that ends the war. So Cuba's independent. We're a big bad country now. We've announced our presence with authority militarily. So you're looking at U.S. status, prestige in the world going up. All right, then we get 3 things. Guam, Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Also, the war kind of officially, unofficial, but it kind of continues the reunification of the United States. So you've got Northerners and Southerners united in the army fighting against the Spanish. You've got this fellow named Wheeler who was in battle, and is famous for saying, to hell with the Yankees, the Spaniards. So he had been a Confederate. And in this little staged picture here, you got a Northern and Southern officer, and they're uniting to free, and the little girl with the chains here, she's Cuba. So they're uniting to free Cuba right here. All right. The Platt Amendment at the end of the war says that Cuba's not really all that independent. Cuba's not allowed to make independent treaties with other countries. They're not allowed to have a real high debt, that they won't be able to pay back. And they've got to let us set up a naval base over there. That's Guantanamo Bay, that is still there and pretty controversial today because terror suspects are kept there. And then finally, it said that we can invade anytime we want to. Anytime we're not happy with what the government's doing over there, we can invade. So kind of halfway between independent and an American colony almost at this point. There's a doctor that's going to go over there named Walter Reed, and he's going to show that, to do a lot of medical research showing that mosquitoes carry yellow fever. And so a lot of medical advances and deaths from yellow fever going down. I believe the hospital in Washington, D.C., the military hospital, Washington, D.C., is called Walter Reed Medical Center or something like that, named after him. Okay. Philippines not happy with it. Okay. So Aguinaldo had been fighting against the Spanish, and he thought that he was fighting for Filipino independence. But then when the war's over, we turn around and say, no, we're taking over. So he leads a rebellion against us, and the United States sends 126,000 troops over there. And the things we do in order to put down the rebellion, kind of anticipating some of the controversy of Vietnam, and echoing stuff that the Spanish had done, and Iraq, echoing some things the Spanish had done, problems of imperial occupation, really, moral problems of imperial occupation. So when we would catch the rebels, we'd put them in camps. We set up same kind of reconcentration camps where people would die, put together, and they'd get sick and they die, and so very controversial. Also, if you wanted to force somebody to tell you where the rebels were, they did this thing that had been practiced during what the Spanish Inquisition, narrative history says, called the water cure, very much like waterboarding that we see today. So if you take a look at the diagram there, you put a stick. It doesn't show anything. You put a stick in the guy's mouth. That way his mouth stays open. Then you pour salt water into his mouth and nose. You fill up his mouth and nose, and you ask him, hey, where is whoever it is you're looking for? And if he won't talk, well, then you stomp on his stomach or you sit on his stomach. And he throws it all up, but it's thrown up with like gastric juices mixed in with it. So, really miserable experience, and you do it again. And then according to narrative history, you do it until one of two things happen. He talks or he dies. He drowns in the salt water and the gastric juices. So, it's torture and controversial. Also, look, here's a picture, you got photographs going here. You got Filipino women, you got American soldiers, and the look in the eyes of the American soldiers here, and the look in the eyes of the women here suggest that, there's less than wholesome activities possibly going to go on here. So, it was a mess. All right. So, William Howard Taft, guy who's going to become the 27th president of the United States and is like Teddy Roosevelt's best friend, gets made the civil governor of the Philippines. And he's just a nice fella. There he is riding a water buffalo over there, easygoing guy, gentle demeanor. And the Filipinos liked him, and he improved the roads and the health and sanitation. The schools, now our presence continue to be resented, but he was a popular governor of the Philippines, famous for throwing parties where he would dance with the Filipino women, and everybody was impressed with how light he was on his feet. But very successful, so successful, in fact, that when the Cubans start to resent American occupation, from time to time American troops would go into Cuba. So when we were occupying Cuba, Teddy Roosevelt sent Taft to be the governor of Cuba for a time. So very successful, really smart guy, Ivy League graduate, high grades, and nice person. Okay. So this is the age of imperialism. So we've been in Cuba, been in the Philippines, and so now we're not taking over and invading China, just the opposite, but we want to make sure nobody else does, because China is the best market in the world, because whatever you're selling, there's more people in China to buy that stuff than any other country in the world. So the United States was concerned that there would be an imperial takeover of China. So Secretary of State John Hay issues the open door policy. So it's going to keep trade with China open. All nations be allowed to trade in China. Nobody's going to take the place over. But all these countries coming in there and trading was resented by a lot of the Chinese. There was a nationalist movement called the Boxer Rebellion, in which they tried to kick out any foreign, especially foreign missionaries, but foreign business people. Another part of the open door policy is that commercial and territorial integrity of China would be respected. So you're keeping the markets open and nobody's taking over Chinese territory. Okay, there we are. All right, and then the last one's going to, I'll let you sit there for a second. Then the last one's going to be Teddy Roosevelt. Pretty good. That's a good question to think about. Although we don't have turning point questions. So we can rephrase that one into continuity and change. Okay, I'm going to make this one a number 4. All right. Both narrative history and American pageant, both of them finish with the Roosevelt foreign policy. Okay, so look at that for a second. Okay, so number 4 right here. So making a number 4. All right, so 1900. Remember, McKinley defeated Bryan the Lion, and they're fighting over like farmers' issues in 1896. McKinley, same two guys run in 1900. Things are going well. Peace and prosperity and expansion. Not really peace, expansion and prosperity. And so McKinley wins bigger this time. He has a bigger share of the vote. So Bryan ends up being a 3-time loser for president. Roosevelt becomes vice president because he's seen as a troublemaker. He was the police commissioner of New York City, and then the governor, I believe became governor of New York. Maybe not, maybe just police commissioner, but so we'll check on that. But he was a progressive. That's the next hobby. So creating problems for the party bosses and the industrialists. So they felt like he would make less trouble as vice president than he was making for, the powers that be in New York. So he becomes vice president. New vice president. All right, shortly after getting reelected, McKinley gets killed by a Slavic immigrant, Chalgosh. He was an anarchist. That's him there. Interesting, story. He was kind of an anarchist reject. So just as Ghetto was kind of a spoil system reject. All of our assassins, our 4 presidential assassins, have been big time misfits. Lee Harvey Oswald's a communist reject, and John Wilkes Booth kind of a Confederate reject in one way or another. He felt like he hadn't lived up to Confederate ideals. All right, so this guy's an anarchist, but he'd been kicked out by the anarchists because he's talking about killing the president. So he does it. It's at the World's Fair in a receiving line. He walks right up to him, shakes his hand, and shoots him. And so the result is Roosevelt becomes the youngest president in history. He had been a former cowboy, he was a graduate of Harvard. He was kind of like Andrew Johnson. Nobody thought he'd ever be president, but now he's president. He's got this motto: "Speak softly and carry a big stick." It's a nice motto. You're not looking for trouble, but you're ready for it if it comes. That sort of thing. However, he never really spoke very softly. He was a big talker. Okay. As president, he wants a canal. He wants a canal dug through Central America some way, so that for ships doing trade and for military purposes, if the Spanish had fought more effectively, we might have needed our ships to be able to go through Central America rather than having to travel all the way around South America. So in a treaty there, the Haight-Ponsonby Treaty, Britain, which had some claims on the area, gave us permission to dig a canal through the Isthmus of Panama. Now Panama was part of the country of Colombia. So we offered Colombia money for it, and they wouldn't sell. And so Roosevelt encouraged a revolution. There had always been kind of folks in Panama wanted to rebel from Colombia. So he encourages this revolution. This fella here, French guy, Philip Bonneville, helps with that revolution. So there is a country of Panama and a canal of Panama Canal today because Teddy Roosevelt wanted it. And that's kind of your perfect picture of Roosevelt. You know, big giant personality, loved politics, enjoyed it, enjoyed the fight, enjoyed fights, enjoyed the job, fearless, very popular historically. I really don't know anybody that hates Teddy Roosevelt. He's going to do some things that one might disagree with. Certainly, I mean, he's an imperialist. But as people look back at Roosevelt, they all kind of like him. All right, so it takes from 1904 to 1910 to dig it. A lot of people died, all the tropical diseases. So mosquito nets are invented, and a lot of disease gets eradicated coming out of that experience. Okay. Roosevelt gets concerned. A lot of the Latin American countries were in debt. These are still young, weak, impoverished countries. And during the age of imperialism, one thing European countries would do, imperialist countries would do, and you kind of see us doing it with Cuba, is something like predatory lending. You see a poor country and then you give them some money and say, hey, you got to pay it back. And they're not going to turn you down. Then when they can't pay you back, you say, oh, gosh, we got to get our money back. We've got investments to protect, so you send in the troops. And so Britain and France were looking at doing that in Latin America. And so Roosevelt says that if you got a Latin American country that can't pay its debts, we'll be the bill collector. We'll collect the debts. We'll be the policeman of the Caribbean Sea. And, we'll make sure the money gets back to whatever European country is owed money. So that was the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, we go back to President Monroe, and the Monroe Doctrine just said, Europe, don't come around here no more. Don't try to get new Latin American colonies now that these countries have gotten their independence from Spain. So now the addition to it is, don't come over here trying to get colonies, even if they owe you money. If they owe you money, we'll take care of it for you. So that's the Roosevelt addition. So it's announcing kind of really an end. This is an end to isolationism. The imperialist period, at least it's a temporary end to isolationism. And he also calls his diplomacy big stick diplomacy. And his big stick is the American Navy. He calls it the Great White Fleet. And they make a point of, purposefully painting our Navy ships white. And so big stick diplomacy is, negotiating from a position of strength, and we might just send in the Navy if you don't do what we want you to do. Now, ironically, being somebody who's kind of into war, sees war as a manly thing that makes a man out of young soldiers, he wins the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, for making peace between Russia and Japan. Russia's kind of an aging power. Japan's kind of a rising power while Roosevelt is president. And they got in a war, Russo-Japanese war, and Japan's winning. And Russia's embarrassed, and you even see the embarrassment in the picture. Russians tend to be kind of big people. This guy's 6'5", 6'6", the Russian ambassador. And then the Japanese ambassadors, they're like 5'8", So this little country with smaller people whooping up on this big country with big people, and Russia's embarrassed. But they're going to lose unless, and be even further humiliated unless a peace treaty can be signed. So he negotiates this treaty in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on board a boat. So there's the picture of the treaty being signed, the picture of the treaty signers. So he wins the Nobel Prize. All right. He also negotiates what's called the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan on immigration. In California, California, for all its reputation of being, open and tolerant place, has never, was not a nice place to Asians. You got the Chinese Exclusion Act coming out of California resentment of Chinese, and now you've got what you had was segregated schools for Japanese. Japanese kids couldn't go to school with the white California kids. So Japan's upset about that. And so they're really mad at the United States. So Roosevelt gets together with leaders of Japan, and it's not a treaty, but it's an agreement, and it's immigration for integration. And so the treaty is that Japan stops sending people to the United States. The Japanese kids that are already in California can go to school with everybody else. So you're going to integrate the schools in exchange for an end to immigration there. All right, the other thing he does at the end of his time in office, he sends the Great White Fleet, the American Navy, all around the world just to show how strong it is. All right, let's look right there. Yep, that's progressives. So that is that chapter. See what we can do here. Hopefully we didn't take that long.